Now, Willie Johnson was the man of the family. He was a fine, fine piper. Oh, the best piper in all of Scotland he was. And at all the fairs and all of the piping competitions, he would always be coming off with all the prizes. And his wife, Jeanie, oh, she was a fine, capable woman. And she had her baskets and her knitting and her little bits of paper and paper flowers and whatnot. And she would go round to the door to hawk these things from door to door. And there was one time Willie said to his missus, he said, Jeanie, I think it's about time we went up to Pitlochry. Now, Pitlochry is in about right in the centre of Scotland, way up on the hills, way up in the Highlands. And he said that it's about the season that the gentry, you know, the rich people, they'll be going up there for the salmon fishing. That'll be good pickings up there for you and I. Sure enough, they bundled themselves up into their wee wagon with the horse in front. They bundled up their two wee wains, their two children, and away they went up to Pitlochry. And they got there in the evening, you know, just as the sun was going down, and they put up their wee bow tent and they covered it over with skin. And Jeanie, she put her children inside and she covered them up with blankets and put a fire on and put on a wee bit of stew for the children to have later on. And Willie said, Jeanie, I'm off to the town. I'm going round the pubs and see if I can scrounge up any money. Sure enough, he took his pipes and down into the town he went. Well, Jeanie, she puttered around getting things ready, putting things away and stabling up the horse. And then she too went down to the town with her basket and her wee baskets and handmade things and paper flowers and things like this. And she went round from door to door and she would say, Missus, have you got any money that you can give me for these wee paper flowers and such? Oh, sure. And they would toss her pennies and give her little things and that. Well, she would go around to the hotels also, and she would knock at the door and say, is there any meat that you can give me for my wee pot way back at the hills? Sure enough, they were always giving her scraps of food, and she'd fill up her basket, and she'd sold quite a lot of her ware going round from door to door, for sure. When you get your foot in the door, you know, a tinker woman is very persistent. Anyway, she did a good bit of business down there in the town. And on her way back, she was going off across a wee bit of a bridge, and she felt like a smoke. She wanted a smoke. So she lifted her hand in behind her apron and fumbled around in the big pocket there to get her wee clay pipe. And she found it, stuck it in between her lips. Fine. And then she stuffed it full of tobacco. Very nice. And then she hunted around for a match to light her pipe. But she didn't have a match on her. Nowhere did she have a match. Oh, I'll have to do without a smoke, she says. But then she looks up on the hill. And what does she see but a wee black house? Now, they weren't really black. They were you know, they had limestone on them and a thatched roof. But they called them black houses because way up in the Highlands, you know, they used to burn peat in the middle of the fire, and the fire was in the middle of the floor, and they had no chimney, so all the smoke from the peat fire would just coat everything inside the house and go up through a hole in the ceiling. And everything was coated black, including the people within. That's why they called them the black houses. But sure enough, that's a strange sight to see up there, says Jeanie. I didn't notice that house on my way down. But I wasn't thinking about that kind of stuff, she said. Fair enough, I'll go up there. I see the smoke rising out of the roof. Sure enough, I'll get a match. Up there, I'll get a light for my pipe. She walked up to the wee house and she knocked on the door. And then the door opened. And this great, huge, old hag of a woman with her hair all hanging down in rat's tails, and her face just a maze of wrinkles, and all the wrinkles were covered with dirt and grime. Oh, she was a horrible, ugly-looking woman. She must have been 100 years old, had she been a day. "Back away with you! Get away with you!" said the old woman. No, said Jeanie. I'm just in here to get a wee light for my pipe. I see a fire going in there. I'll just have a wee light. No, I've got visitor tonight. No, you can't come. Oh, sure, I'll just be a second. Not a moment, and no bother, not at all. Oh, all right. And you go, but be quick about it. Well, Jeanie, she comes in there and she looks around and she takes a wee lump for the fire and gets her pipe going and says, "Thank you very much," and away she goes. up to the wee bow tent where the children are sleeping. And she puts the scraps of meat into the pot and stirs it up for the children to have. And they have a fine meal, but Willie Johnson, he didn't return. That night it was very, very late, so Jeanie went to bed herself after putting down the wain. Well, next morning she wakes up bright and early, and there Willie Johnson is not in the house. Oh, what's happened to him, she says. Oh, I know what's happened. He's got into a bit of a row, and he's had a fight, and the police have come and put him in jail for the night. Oh, it's not the first time that such a thing had happened. Anyways, she decided that she'd better go down to the town to find out just where Willie Johnson was. Sure enough, she walked down the town, and she went to all the pubs and chapped at the door. Oh, sure, Willie's been here, a fine piper, ma'am. Yes, he was. Oh, and the gentry treated him well and gave him a couple of gills, that's true, but no, he behaved himself. He's on his way. He was on his way early. He said he had to get back to his wife in Wayne's. Oh, they all said that at each pub she went to. Oh, but he must have got in trouble on the way. She said, I'll go to the police. I'll go to the police station and see if he's in the jail. Well, she knocked at the door, and the sergeant comes up and says, oh, no, Willie, your man, he was here last night, sure, in the town, but he behaved himself well. A fine piper he is, yes. But he left early. He's not in here. I don't know where he is. Well, she didn't know what to do, you know. But she made her way back to the tent, and she kept the bairns happy and warm for a few days, and she sold her scraps and bits and pieces around from door to door. But then, you know, you can't stay any too long in one place. She had to move on. She didn't know where Willie Johnson had gone, but she went on anyways. And she said, oh, well, there's the harvest fairs down in the south there, in the Lothians. They'll be getting the harvest in about this time. Sure enough, I'll find word of him there. Because all the tinkers, they gathered in a certain spot, you know, and they always exchanged family information back and forth. Well, she went down, and she asked high and low, had anybody heard of Willie Johnson? But no, they hadn't. Years passed, and she still heard no word of Willie Johnson. He'd disappeared. Well, she made out as best she could. The children were rising to her. They were fine, grown-up men and women at this town. 20 years later it was. They had bairns of their own, and they left Jeanie all alone. But she still went about her business, and at one time, 20 years later, she found herself right up on the hill at the back of Pitlochry, where she had left Willie Johnson. And she put up her wee bow tent, and she took her basket full of her wares down to the town, and she chapped at all of the doors, but, oh, go away with you, go away with you. They were different people nowadays, you know. They didn't want the woven baskets made out of reeds and stubbles. No, they didn't want the brooms made out of bloom and broom. No, they wanted things made out of plastic and things that came from Japan and America. You know, they didn't want her little bits and pieces. And she went round to the pubs too and the restaurants, but no, there wasn't very much pickings for her. Very dispirited she was. And she made her way back to her wee bow tent. And she crossed over a wee bit of a bridge and wanted to smoke. So she put her hand into her pocket, pulled out a wee bit of a pipe, stopped it full of tobacco, and hunted round for a match. But sure enough, she didn't have a match on her. So what does she do? But she sees this wee house up among the heather there and says, well, I'll go up there and get a light. Sure enough, she goes up, chaps on the door, and this old hag of a woman opens the door and says, and what are you doing here? Oh, I just come to get a light for my pipe from your fire, ma'am. I won't be long. Oh, go away with you, go away with you. I've got company tonight. Oh, sure enough, I'll only be a second. All right, all right, all right. Come in, but be quick about it. So the old woman let her in, and she went over to the fire and was bending down to light her pipe. But as she was doing it, didn't she hear this music? And it was fine, fine music. It was piping music. And she listened to the buttles and the skirl of the pipes. And Sure enough, that was Willie Johnson. She'd know him anywhere. He was the finest piper in all of Scotland. What was he doing there? Well, she noticed over to the side a wee bit of a door. And she went over very quickly and she opened it up. And sure enough, it wasn't a wee black house. In there, it was a fairy palace. There were fairies dancing around and jigging and reeling and dancing and cavorting, and there was golden banners and all dressed in the finery, and they were dancing and skirling around. And there at the foremost, right in front of them, was her man, Willie Johnson. But he was only about 4 to 7 inches tall, skirling away on his pipes. Oh, Willie, my man, she says, and she dived into the hall and she grabbed a hold of Willie's arm and started pull him across the threshold of that wee house. And she kept pulling and pulling, but the old hag, she grabbed hold of the other hand and started pulling the opposite direction. Come back with him, we need the music. No, no, he's my man, said Jeanie. Oh, they were tugging back and forth, but then she put her foot against the threshold and tugged and fell back onto the ground with Willie Johnson on top of her. When she got to her feet, the wee house had disappeared. There was not a sign of it, nor of the old woman, nor of the fairy palace. And there, standing beside him, right back up to his full height, was Willie Johnson, her man that she hadn't seen for 20 years. Oh, Willie Johnson, my man, she says. Oh, go away with you. You old hag, you old woman, get away with you. I've got a wife and bairns up in the hill and I must be getting back to them. And off he tromps, up the hill, leaving her there on the ground. And then it occurred to her that he'd been with the fairies all this time. And in 20 years, he was not 1 day, 1 minute, 1 hour older than he was 20 years before. For amongst the fairies, you know, there is no time. That's the story of Willie Johnson.